Whenever I have an opportunity like this, I actually feel pretty embarrassed at times because I usually end up getting credit for things that other people have really worked hard on with me. And I have to say, the truth is, you all didn't steal that whole rhythm thing from me. My energizing method is caffeine. And if any of you have ever seen me dance, you know why. So I'm actually very, very fortunate to work with people all over the world in almost every discipline you can think of. We have people in the corporate sector that we work with and learn from. We have people that are judges. We have people that are, believe it or not, politicians. We really are a unique and collegial group. And one of the things that I think is really wonderful about our evolving relationship with Harmony is that it's filled with people that have really big hearts, but also good heads. One of the big issues in our field is that it's not, we're not lacking in people who really care. Part of the problem is that we have been working really, really, really hard in a lot of different areas, but I think sometimes that we have been hindered by a lack of understanding about certain aspects of the way human beings function. And I think that if you take the hard work that people are putting into helping children and helping families, and you combine that with the good intentions and big hearts, and a better understanding of the way people function and change, that we'll have much better outcomes. And that's a big part of what we've been doing over the last 30 years as an organization. We've been trying to engage with people who are hardworking and big-hearted and give them better tools to do this work. And a component of those tools is sort of related to building capacity, building awareness and knowledge about what it is that is going on with the kids that we're working with, and a lot of times their families, and what we can do with it. Sometimes use the analogy that part of what we do is that we're sort of like mechanics. We're trying to help people understand how the engine works in a car. We're focusing on the brain. The brain, we think if you understand how the brain works and functions and changes and what goes wrong with it, then you're able to sort of be better at targeting what system to change and what activities and actions will result in change in the brain, kind of like a mechanic does with a car that doesn't seem to be working very well. So, I think all of us, one of the big problems is that if you have a child who has a really, we use the term neurotypical, right? If you have a child who's had a developmental set of experiences where there's been consistency and predictability and nurturance, within a pretty wide range of variance. It's not like, there's the perfect way to parent. There's a lot of different ways that you can parent that result in a healthy kid. So most of the kids that we end up working with, and most of the kids that are born into our families, come with sort of the raw material, and then we provide the experiences to help them express their potential, and they actually function pretty well. And so we use a whole set of standard parenting practices and standard caregiving practices and educational practices that seem to work pretty well. So most little kids that are 3, 4, 5 years old, and they're sort of getting in trouble, when they see that you're not happy about that, and you give them the feedback that, no, that's not the way to do this, let's do something else, most of the time these kids will, after a couple tries, they'll pick up on it.
and their behavior will shift. And they'll understand, that with sort of the reward and consequence that they're shaped by is the reward is your attention and approval. And you're like, they love you and they want to please you. And then the thing that's sort of the consequence is, oh, I've displeased you, you're unhappy. And so literally by just interacting with them, kind of the way we would normally, most of us would parent, it shapes their behavior in pretty much an acceptable way. Kind of like when you go to the car dealer and you buy a brand new car, our expectation is that when you put your foot on the gas pedal, the car is going to go faster. And when you put your foot on the brake, the car is going to stop. And, you kind of pretend you know what's going on underneath the hood, right? So like if the car won't start and you're going, oh my God, and you kind of walk out and you open the hood and you go, oh, let me look at that. You don't know what you're doing. You sort of check the oil as if that has anything to do with starting the car. But you kind of look at it a little bit and you might fool around with it. And then along comes somebody who understands how the brain works or how the engine works. And they just tweak one little thing and the car starts and you're like, oh my God, you're a magician. This is unbelievable. Thank you so much. Now I can get to Nashville. But this is kind of what happens with these kids that we work with, that you just can't drive off the lot and turn the key and put the pedal down and expect them to go. You put the pedal down, the gas pedal, and say, I should be going faster, and all of a sudden the car just goes, and the worst thing is, you get out, you kick the tires, you come back in, and you'll turn the key, and you put the gas on it, and all of a sudden it goes. You're like, what the hell? This didn't work yesterday, now it works today. And then what you do, oh, yes, and then next time you go kick the tires, and then it won't work again. What do you mean? It worked yesterday when I kicked the tires. And so this inconsistency in how it works leads to frustration with the car. And of course, if any of you have ever been in a car that sort of doesn't really work right, how regulated do you stay? You don't sit there and go, oh, gee, I really wish you'd start. So part of what we've been trying to do over the last 30 years really is understand really what's under the hood. How is it that some kids end up being so different in the way they respond to nurturing than other kids? How is it that some kids can be so reactive that you ask them to do a tiny little thing and they'll literally behave as if you're trying to, hurt them or injure them just because you want them to pick up their crayons? The kind of thing you're like, what? Like, this is a little out of proportion. The reactivity that these kids have, sort of the relational, what a term I'll use and help you understand, at least the way we use this term, relational sensitivity. Where does that come from? And part of what has happened in our work is that little by little by little, we think that we've learned more about, number one, what has happened on the assembly line that has led to this car having some difficulties. And then number two, what do you do about it? How do you take an engine that's already been built and go back into it and somehow fiddle with or modify or sometimes even replace a part that should have been put in this third step of building the engine, as opposed to now that the engine's completely organized? This is one of the biggest challenges that we have. We have these children who have these incredibly complex engines in their brain, or in their head, which is the brain, and we don't know that much about the brain. Even the people that know a lot about the brain don't know that much about the brain. Now, I'll talk about a little bit about that tomorrow. I don't want to get too I want to sort of make you like me before I make you learn too much neuroscience. So tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about some of the complexities of the brain, but I want you to appreciate that it's really complex. And even though there are some really important and I would say pretty simple principles about the way the brain develops and changes, it's amazing how infrequently we actually incorporate that understanding into the way we parent, into the way we do education, into the way we do therapeutics. And that's what I want to share with you over the next couple of days, is some of the stuff that we've sort of stumbled into that's helped us do some of this work. Now, before I get going too far, what I really want to do today is, again, I'm going to, a lot of the things I talk about, I present, I let go, I come back again, and I elaborate a little bit more, and then I'll come back again. And so I do iterative teaching. So a lot of what I talk about today, I'll revisit tomorrow in a little bit more detail. We'll take a little bit deeper dive. But one of the key things I want you to walk away from this entire, if you take one thing away, it's to remember that ultimately the single most important thing about engaging and helping these children is you. It's not your theoretical frame of reference. It's not that you're trained in a certain perspective or you use a certain kind of, the right medicine or the right diagnosis. That has much less to do with how these kids do than how much respect you show them, than how much tenderness and presence you can demonstrate in the face of their frustration and rage. It's you. It's your ability to connect with them that ultimately is the vehicle for them healing. And as you well know, they've learned all kinds of ways to make it hard to connect. And they have some reasons for that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in the end, what I really want you to understand is that you're really important. You and the people that are in the life of the child, who spend time with the child, who sit with the child, that's what makes difference in the child's life. It's not having, again, like I said, it's not the right program, it's not the right place, it's not, it's not the right clothes, it's not the right food. Now, food's, it's important. It's literally, in the end, it's fundamentally the core is the relationship. And maybe by the time we finish, or I finish tomorrow, you'll have some understanding of how the neurobiology of relationships connects with the neurobiology of stress and dysregulation, and how the neurobiology of relationships connects with the neurobiology of reward and consequence. All of these things are interrelated. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. Now, one of the things I'm going to talk about a lot is the brain. And, the reason I'm going to talk about the brain is that my bias and my theory of change about interacting with other people, whether it's as a coach or a parent or as a teacher or therapist, is that when I do this with you, I'm influencing your brain. And more recently, I've come to understand that you're influencing my brain. The interesting thing is, we talk so much about this one-way sort of path from the adult to the child. And we don't talk as much as we should about the child, this reciprocal process of the child impacting, influencing the neurobiology of the adult. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about interconnectivity, because the truth is, if we keep looking and having this one-way model of behavioral change, we're never going to be that effective. And oddly enough, in the end, you'll come to appreciate, I hope, that the secret ingredient to effective interconnectivity, that leads to positive change is how you are regulated. Have you taken care of yourself? And that sounds kind of selfish, but the truth is, you need a little bit of this selfishness to be unselfish. And there's a biology to that I'll explain as we go. But let's talk about the brain. The human brain is just this astounding, remarkable organ. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but one of the great qualities that the brain has is that it has this capacity to store experience very efficiently. And humans are unlike any other species on the planet in that we can store more bits of information per second than any other species. And this allows us to essentially go from generation to generation to generation and kind of accumulate learning, accumulate knowledge. And so if you think about, the fact that in the 8th grade kids right now who are sitting in an 8th grade class, biology class, kids that have IQs from 80 to 120, a whole range of sort of intelligence capabilities, are learning about DNA and other aspects of genetics that 20 years ago were unknown to the entire human species. In fact, the stuff that they're learning today that's just sort of like the normal, genetics, whatever, that kind of stuff that they're learning, people got the Nobel laureate for that content just 10 years ago. And it's just pretty stunning to think about this. I mean, what our children are learning and the world they're growing up in is so very different than the world that we grew up in. And if you talk to your grandparents or think about your parents and the world they grew up in, it's even more astounding. I remember when I was a kid, actually, I talked to my grandmother, and she said, well, when I was born, and actually when she remembers when she was, I think she was like 14 or 15, and she said, we were so stunned that the Wright brothers had actually invented the plane and had flown something like 200 yards. And I just thought, how amazing that in her lifetime, people landed on the moon from a time when they didn't even have she grew up as a little kid, they had 1 or 2 automobiles that were on the streets of Bismarck, North Dakota. And so, I had kind of an experience like that. My grandson was kind of going through some, you know how they are, the little 5-year-olds, they open every drawer, pull stuff out. They pulled out a phone and it's like, what's this? Because they'd never seen like a wall phone, that had like push buttons. They're like, what is that? And I'm like, oh my gosh. The world is changing. And the organ that allows us to do this is the brain. Most specifically, the top part of the brain, the cortex. Now, this is really an amazing part of your brain. This is the part of your brain that really is responsible for learning speech and language, and it's a part of the brain that's responsible for all your abstract thinking. And when you daydream like you are kind of now, partially, it's okay. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that as an adaptation to inescapable, unavoidable pain. It's true. That's sad but true. But when your brain has this remarkable capacity to store information, and the cortex has that capability sort of the most. And so the most unique, powerful, strong part of your brain that mediates almost all of our human characteristics is the top part of your brain, the cortex. Now, one of the most interesting phenomenon about the cortex is that you don't have any direct connection from this really smart part of your brain to the outside world. No direct connection. It has to get filtered through middle parts of the brain. Now you can kind of appreciate, I'm going to take this little pen here and you can see you've got these middle parts of your brain. Now this drawing, I actually put a little eyeball here, which isn't exactly part of your brain, but it's connected to your brain. But what happens is when things come from the outside world, it goes in through your optic nerve, and it goes into a sort of a central or lower part of your brain, actually, most of it. Now, the reason that's important is that this top part of your brain is actually kind of smart. It's the smartest part of your brain. You do most of your good thinking in that part of the brain. That part of the brain can tell time. So, like when you get the sense, when you tell a 2-year-old that, oh, I'm going to be gone on my trip for a week, do they understand that? No, they don't understand that because their cortex, the top part of their brain, is very undeveloped. It's not developed enough yet to have a sense of time. And so as you get older and your cortex grows and gets more elaborate and powerful, it starts to get the capacity to understand that when mom and dad go out to a movie, they'll be back in 3 hours. That starts to make sense. But if you have part of your cortex that's undeveloped and immature, when mom and dad go out, to the brain of that child, they think you're gone. Now, everybody in this room who's worked with a kid who's been adopted or in foster care knows that those kids don't have a sense of time the same way you do. So you can try to reassure. Sometimes, you get taken by surprise how overwhelmed they'll get when you're going to go do something and be gone and not include them, and you try to explain it to them, and it's no consolation whatsoever, right? Part of that's because that cortical part of their brain is either still undeveloped or partially shut down by fear. And we'll come back and talk about that a lot, because a lot of the things that we assume our kids can do, the truth is, if you could read underneath that, we're assuming that their cortex is available to do those things. But one of the fundamental principles related to trauma and trauma-related consequences for how the brain works is that the cortex tends to be underdeveloped if you've had chronic trauma, and number 2, shut down. So all of the things about time and reasoning and logic and rules of the house go out the window to these kids because that part of their brain is not online to do the work. And we're going to come back and talk about that. That concept, that basic principle, we refer to kind of as state-dependent functioning. And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit later on. But one of the key points here is that information from the outside world, in order to get up to this smart part of your brain, has to go through lower parts of the brain that have the opportunity to process and act on that incoming information before they pass it on to the smart part of your brain. Again, we'll come back and talk about the implications of that quite a bit. So, that's a little bit about the brain. That's kind of what the brain looks like. We end up using a completely different, if you will, it's a model, a working model of the brain. And I'll just put this up here. This is something that we're going to talk about quite a bit. I'm going to use this as a working model of the brain. And really, this is, of course, as I know you all appreciate, that this is really not at all what the brain looks like. This is a cartoon, and it's an oversimplification. But it makes a couple of key points. The first key point is that the brain actually has this hierarchical organization. That's really important. So the hierarchical organization I've already been referring to. You've got this top part of your brain that mediates these most complex human functions like thinking, sense of time, abstract cognition, sequencing and planning and that sort of thing. So when you tell a child, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get up in the morning, I want you to make your bed, I want you to put on your clothes, I want you to brush your teeth, and then I want you to come to breakfast. And that's a compound command, right? There's a lot of things that you're asking that child to do. You're basically forcing them, expecting them to use this part of their brain. And as most of you, I think, recognize, for many of the kids we work with, that level of complex compound command is hard for them to follow through with. And again, we'll come back and talk about this later on. But when you are giving that command, part of you has the expectation that they have full access to their cortex. Now, as you go lower in the brain, there are systems and networks that mediate simpler functions. And as you get to the lowest parts of the brain, the lower parts of the brain mediate the most regulatory parts of your functioning, heart rate, cardiovascular functioning, and so forth. And we use the term heuristic, which is basically a teaching device. This is a teaching device. Now, so, the first thing I wanted you to see, number one, is that we've got this hierarchical organization. Very important. The second thing, and I'll talk about this again a little bit more tomorrow, but one of the real challenges of having 86 billion moving parts, which are 86 billion neurons in your brain, is that you have to somehow figure out how to get them to work together. And you have all these different regions in your brain. How do you get them to work together? And one of the solutions to that is basically solved. One of the basic solutions is to connect all these different parts of the brain and body with one set of systems. And so you have these really unique regulatory networks that originate in the lower part of your brain and connect directly to every other part of your brain. And what this allows these systems to do then is collectively communicate to every part of the brain simultaneously and receive information collectively from every part of the brain. So it is kind of the main integrator of ongoing function, background functioning in your brain. Now, these systems are really important. You've heard of them. Everybody's heard of norepinephrine and dopamine and serotonin, and some of you might have heard of acetylcholine. But there's a collection of these fundamental regulatory networks that have distribution throughout the whole rest of the brain. Now, the other thing they do is that they have influence, both directly and indirectly, to every other part of the body. And so you have nerves that go directly from these lower parts of your brain out to your heart and your lung and your gut and your skin. And you have systems that are right here that are regulated by these neural networks that release hormones. And you guys have probably heard of cortisol, right? So all of this stuff, all this neurohormonal, neuroimmune, and direct autonomic nervous system functioning that goes out to the body originates and is influenced directly by these neural networks. This architecture, this microarchitecture of these systems allows us to have really pretty seamless functioning across all these different organ systems. So our heart influences parts of our brain. And our brain influences release of insulin from our pancreas. And all these things are interconnected, which is important because if these neural networks have anything that goes wrong with them, you'll end up having a set of problems in multiple parts of your body and brain that confuse the mental health system, the healthcare system, the education system, and so forth. Now, just let me walk you through this for 1 second. How many of you have seen something like, I think I have it in here somewhere. You'll have a child that you've worked with, and you may have an opportunity to see their records, and you get something like this. Now, again, you probably can't read this, but I'm sure most of you can kind of guess pretty much what this is. This is from an 8-year-old girl who had developmental trauma And this is how she confused the mental health system. Now, this is one of, I think this is probably her 7th or 8th assessment. And she was given the diagnoses of oppositional defiant disorder, rule out ADHD, mood disorder, rule out bipolar disorder, PTSD, reactive attachment disorder, enuresis, blah, blah, blah. And of course, essentially, the reason she was getting all these labels was that, as I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, when these systems have intrauterine, perinatal, and postnatal disruptions, they function abnormally. And of course, when they function abnormally, what that means is every single part of the brain and body that they send signals to will literally have a significant increased risk for abnormal functioning. Now here's what happens. You get a kid who has these systems that get abnormally regulated, or something happens during development, some developmental insult, intrauterine alcohol, intrauterine meth, intrauterine stress or distress of the mother, postnatal attachment disruption of the mother, for example, she might be in a domestic violence relationship, and then as the child gets older, he gets exposed to violence, community violence, whatever it is. These systems will become abnormally regulated. And because they're abnormally regulated, this child, when somebody looks at his ability to attend, they'll see, oh, he's got attentional problems. And when they see this child's ability to form and maintain relationships, they'll go, oh, he's got relational problems. And when they look at his ability to learn how to read, they'll go, oh, he has reading problems. And when they look at his ability to regulate reward, and they'll see, oh, he's got vulnerability to substance abuse. And when they see they look at his regulation of insulin, they go, oh, he's got pre-diabetic condition. And when they look at anything. But see, here's the problem. We don't have a system that is designed to look at kids as a whole. We have systems that look at component parts. So when this child goes to school, the school sees him as an impulsive, inattentive kid. And they send him off to somebody who will give him ADHD diagnosis and give him medication. But he also has a learning problem, so they'll send him to a social skills group or a psychology, educational psychologist for tutoring. And they'll send him to a social skills group, and they'll send him to an OT, and they'll say, oh, sensory integration problems. And everybody's like at the Tower of Babel, or the blind man at the elephant, right? They're all seeing a different part of the whole, and everybody's using their own frame of reference, and everybody is giving this poor family advice. And of course, by the way, the OT is over in this part of town, and the educational psychologist in that part of town, and you can see the pediatrician will see you once every 6 months and change medications, and you get fragmented care. How many of you have experienced fragmented care with these kids? Right? How many of you have at times actually felt like you know more about this than the professional that you're seeking help from? That's all? I would suspect most of you have read all kinds of stuff, and then you go and you say, here's what I see, and here's what I see, and here's what I see, and the pediatrician or the psychiatrist or somebody will see the kid for 10 minutes and say, oh, here, take this prescription, and you're like, well, really, you sure? Oh, yeah, go. Happens all the time. Happened to that little girl. Let me just give an example of the way they decided they were going to treat her with all these disorders. Now, you probably can't read this, so let me read this to you. This is the medications that this 8-year-old girl had been on. Adderall, Ativan, Cogentin, Depakote, Depakote, DDAVP, Haldol, Imipramine, Klonopin, Lithium, Moban, Risperdal, Ritalin, Serentil, Seroquel, Strattera, Tegretol, Tenix, Thorazine, Trileptal, Vistaril, Wellbutrin, and Zyprexa, and currently was on DDAVP, Trileptal, Zydus, and Zyprexa. And did any of it help? No. So they literally moved her from place to place to place to place, and finally moved her from the East Coast out to that hotbed of psychiatric excellence, Louisiana. Just saying. No offense to Louisiana, but, I guess they literally said that they could not find in the Philadelphia, Washington, New York area any clinicians who could treat her. She was so challenging, which I found astoundingly impossible to believe. And then, of course, this hotbed of excellence that she was at in Louisiana said that she's untreatable, we can't help her anymore, so they were going to send her to an outdoor a wilderness program in Utah. Little girl from inner city Philly, going to go to an outdoor wilderness program, and they did not even have a master's level clinician on their staff. This is one of these places where they just take you out and literally take you out in the frickin' woods, and if you want to eat hot food, you got to make your own fire, and somehow that's going to help with your attachment issues. I'm like, huh? It's like, okay. It's like, let's think this through a little bit. Anyway. Now, and again, I'm only giving this by way of example of how these kids confuse good clinicians. I'm saying these people are at major academic medical centers. The people that treated her wrote chapters in our textbooks. And they did this. And they sent her off to these other places. That's the state of our field, mental health, globally, understanding trauma. Now, it's getting better. But I just want you to understand that because we have not been able to really look at what's under the hood and really see that very well, we've been doing a lot of things that are well-intended but are kind of stupid. Now, so here's a couple things that we knew about the brain that we thought were helpful. One was, we think that if you understand this a little bit, there's a couple of really important observations that you can make that can really be helpful for thinking about the origins of the problems that we see, the common problems that we see with these kids. And then number two, what are the logical implications for therapy if this is true? So here's what we know. Let's talk about this a tiny little bit. We'll come back to this a lot. But let's talk about neuroplasticity. Now, and again, you're going to see this slide again, and I'll talk about this in a couple of different ways. But the first thing I want to just sort of have you think about is that neurons, the way you get function, the way your brain, and again, this is sort of, as you can imagine, a gross oversimplification. But the way that touch works, for example, which is a brain-mediated function, is that when you put your finger on something, you have specialized nerves in your skin that can feel pressure and they can feel temperature. And so that signal goes from your finger. Now, the interesting thing is, if you could sort of freeze in time all of these activities in this chain of interconnected neurons, when you put your finger initially on something that was hot or cold, you literally don't feel it yet. You don't feel it until it gets into your spinal cord. And even then, you don't feel it. It goes and it connects to another neuron in your spinal cord. And then that sends a signal up into a lower part of your brain. And at that point, you still don't feel it. It has to go to another neuron in the central part of your brain, and then you feel it. Then you get the sensation of touch. Now, the interesting thing is, at that point, when this chain of neurons is activated and it gets to the middle part of your brain, all you can tell is that you're being touched. You don't know where. And if there's no tissue damage, like if there's nothing that is destroying cells, you don't know whether this is necessarily warm or cold or what it is. It has to go through a higher set of processing, and then ultimately, the sensation of touch comes from activating neurons in your cortex. And I'm saying all of this because function is created by a chain of interconnected neurons. And so the whole function requires the whole intact loop, which is really, I'm going to sort of tie this all together, hopefully, in a way that makes sense. But the key is that incoming information has multiple steps where it gets processed before it gets to the smart part of your brain. That's the most important learning. Now, the second really important part about this with relation to neuroplasticity is that neural networks that mediate function, like you have neural networks that are responsible for your being able to move your fingers. You have neural networks that are responsible for you being able to speak. You have neural networks that are responsible, literally, when they're activated, you feel positive regard for somebody. You have networks when they're activated, you feel fearful. And so we've got all these complex neural networks in our brain that are allowing us to do everything that we do. And these neural networks can change. Even after they're developed, even after your brain's pretty much developed like ours, you can change your brain. The number one most important aspect of changing neural networks, however, is that if you don't activate the right neural network, you're not going to change the function. So if you want a child to learn how to play the piano, and you put him in front of a video game, or a video, a CD or a DVD of somebody playing the piano, he'll learn certain things. He'll learn that there's an instrument called the piano, and he'll learn that you can, there's white keys and there's black keys, and they make different kinds of noises. So he'll learn a lot of sort of things about playing the piano, but he will not learn to play the piano. The only way to change piano playing neural networks is to actually play the piano. The only way to learn how to shoot free throws is to literally put a ball in your hand and shoot the free throws. Now again, you can learn all kinds of other stuff that will help you when you put the ball in the hand. I mean, you can learn that, all right, getting a little ritual is important, the way you hold the ball is important. So you can get cognitive instruction that will help you with the development of this motor skill. The key is, however, you have to adhere to the principle of specificity. And let's go back now and let me just show you something about these neural networks. See these neural networks right here? These neural networks, because of where they're located, and because they reach every part of the brain and body, these neural networks comprise the backbone of your body's capacity to deal with any stressor. And there are multiple stressors. There's stressors that come from inside your body, right? A stressor is anything that basically moves your body out of equilibrium. And so if you go for 24 hours without eating food, you are pushing your body out of equilibrium. And you'll get signals from your body that come in and say, hey, I'm your internal world here, and I'm sending you feedback about my heart rate, and I'm sending you feedback about the fact that I don't have enough glucose. And because you go so long, it will go up into this part of the brain, and you will feel distress. And that sensation of hunger, you will have labeled appropriately because you've been hungry before, and you'll make a plan about, hey, I need to go to the refrigerator and make a sandwich. And so you have this multiple levels of processing that leads to action. And so the reality is the stress response about being hungry is getting off your ass and going to the refrigerator and making a sandwich. The response involves physical mobilization in response to the distress about being hungry. And so that's a stressor. You can have a stressor that has to do with having your active working memory too full. Active working memory is a cup. Envision it as a cup. that sits on a sponge, which would be your short-term memory. And active working memory is continually getting stuff from the outside world. And if you get too much stuff too fast, it fills up and your brain goes, oh. And then to regulate yourself, because the stress response to a full active working memory cup is to dissociate. You guys have been doing that all day. And you laugh, but that's exactly what you've been doing. I teach something and I say something and it kind of goes into this active working memory cup and it gets full and your brain goes, ugh. And it's dripping into your short-term memory. And then as you disengage, what you do is you take some of what you've heard from me and you reflect on it with this really smart part of your brain. And you think, I wonder where that fits in my catalog of this. This reminds me of that. And that's the way cognition normally works. It's not a bad thing, it's just the reality. But you need to recognize that human beings, really, when you get too much stuff in the present, this is one of the great ways that our brain has evolved to allow us to store tons of information. We don't completely shut out the external world. We sort of basically internalize content in background. And so while I'm going on and on and on and on, there's part of your brain going, okay, let's do this. You're able to do parallel processing a little bit. And if I say something really interesting or if I change the slides, your brain goes, oh, what is that? And so you'll be externally focused for about the 8 seconds that say, oh, he was sorry, or the 2 seconds. But when I show something like this or like this, oh my God, that one's different. What does this one mean? Oh, what does that mean? Oh my God, it's so confusing. Now, so your brain, we have all these systems that are in equilibrium, right? You have systems that have to do with your body temperature, your respiration. You have all systems that are continually monitoring the outside world to see whether or not there's novelty, which activates your stress response, right? Novelty, the default response of your brain to anything new is like, uh-oh. It's not, oh, this is awesome. It's like, what is that? So all coming information comes in, it gets matched against previously stored information, and if that information is familiar, your brain kicks it up to this next higher level. And it gets processed again sort of at this middle level. And the middle level basically processes it and says, oh, this is familiar, safe, neutral. This is familiar, negative. If it's familiar, negative, you activate your stress response. Now, so remember this, novelty or tapping into previous patterns of neural activity that were connected with bad things in the past, both of those activate the stress response. We'll come back and talk about this after the break quite a bit. With the break, by the way, just so those of you can sort of reassure yourself when you're daydreaming, is at 10. Okay, all right, so now when these systems get any kind of input, that you are out of equilibrium, right? If you're out of respiratory equilibrium, right, you get the feedback from this part of the body, the inside of your body that says, oh my gosh, I'm not getting enough oxygen. What will happen is at this low level down here, pretty soon you'll start doing things like taking deeper breaths. You might yawn. And all of this stuff might be happening at a level that you're not even consciously aware of, because the internal signal here is handled in an unconscious way. So if the little bit of the tiny little shift in oxygen can be coped with by breathing more frequently and a little bit deeper, it doesn't get to the level of your consciousness. Which is the way, you talk about the autonomic nervous system, that's the way a lot of this stuff goes. Very few of you are aware of, at any given moment, your own heart rate, right? But what will happen is, if I had everybody stand up right now, your body would send a signal to your brain that says, hey, I'm actually not getting enough oxygen and into perfusion to my cortex. And so you would actually increase your heart rate and change the constriction of your blood vessels so that you would maintain an adequate amount of oxygen to your brain. So all these things are happening in the background. Now, later on when I talk about an overly reactive or sensitized stress response, I'm going to come back and we'll talk about this, because what will happen is when you are sitting and you stand up and you make a, quote, transition to the break, your stress response is so well regulated that it will do all of the adjustments that it needs to do in background. But if you have a dysregulated and sensitized stress response, like I'm going to talk about after the break, a transition as simple as getting up from a table where you've been coloring and being asked to stand in line can make a child feel that they're being threatened. And they'll behave as if they're in a fearful situation, which sometimes involves that fight or flight behavior. So, we'll come back and talk more about this in a minute. I wanted to go back to neuroplasticity, specificity. All right, so if you remember these neural networks right here, right? How many of you heard of the ACE studies? Everybody just about now. It's amazing. 20 years ago when I'd say, hey, who's heard of the ACE studies? They'd be like, not a single person. It's pretty cool, actually. So, the ACE studies, epidemiological studies, kind of a 50,000-foot flyover of somebody's developmental history. You ask, hey, did this bad thing ever happen in your life? And if you endorse it, you go, yeah, okay, I had sexual abuse, I had conflict, and all this other bad stuff. And the more of these bad things that happen during development, the greater at risk you are for, interestingly enough, stuff like diabetes or heart disease. And when this first came out, the people who were actually, even the people doing these studies, had no clue why. But I just told you why, right? Right? I told you because what we know is that if you take these stress systems that are involved in every function, everything, and that was one of the confusing things about the ACE studies. If you go to a group of people and you look at their ACE score, you'll find increased risk is correlated with bad outcomes in everything. Difficulty with pregnancy. It's higher probability of being a victim of a crime, higher probability of committing a crime, higher probability of school failure, higher probability of physical health problems, mental health problems, social problems, just about everything that the brain mediates, right? And everything that the body does. If you have developmental adversity, your risk for having problems in those areas goes up. And of course, this did not make sense because very few people were aware of sort of this unifying, if you will, neuroscience of the stress response. And the people that were studying this were like, oh, well, that kind of makes sense. The people that were studying the neuroscience of stress were like, oh, that kind of makes sense. In fact, we've seen studies like this before, where if you look at combat veterans, prisoners of war, they die way earlier than other, a cohort that weren't in combat and weren't prisoners of war. Oh, and by the way, they get heart disease and manifest diabetes a whole decade earlier than same age cohorts. And so this stuff has been out there for a long time, but people haven't connected the dots. Many of you are working with kids that also have asthma or increased rates of other health problems. The 4% of kids, now this may be outdated, this is from a study done about 15 years ago, but the 4% of kids that were in out-of-home care in California consumed 43% of their Medicaid dollars. Pretty significant. And I think that similar, maybe not that big of a number, but similar overrepresentations have been seen in other studies of kids that are in the foster care system. These kids have a higher probability of learning problems, social problems, mental health problems, physical health problems, and you are taking care of them. And it's a challenge. So, there will be good news in here somewhere, don't worry. Let's talk a little bit about some of the good news. One of the really powerful pieces of good news has to do with this. One of the principles of neuroplasticity is this specificity, that if you want to change neural networks, you've got to sort of activate and get to the neural networks you're interested in. The other thing has to do with pattern. You can't just get to the neural network you're interested in and stimulate it once. You can't learn how to shoot free throws by actually shooting one perfect free throw and go, oh, I'm done. That's it. Or like I can learn how to play the piano by just sitting at the keys and tinkling once. You have to have repetition, 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 repetition. And the more a neural network is ingrained, the more you have to have repetitions to alter that default set of associations. Now, one of the key things about the brain is that when the brain is organizing, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but when the brain is organizing in utero, and a huge percentage, a very large percentage of development of the brain takes place in utero, which of course means that the intrauterine period is extremely important for the health and welfare of the child, which means that if we take care of young pregnant mothers, we will be really decreasing the burden that we have down the road. So, in utero, you're making millions and billions of neurons. And so you make all these cells, and they divide, and they migrate, and they start to create these different structures of your brain, but they're not all necessarily connected. They've just started to send out sort of axonal connections to other neurons, and there are quite a few synaptic connections that are created in utero. But after you're born, there's this explosion of synaptic proliferation. So these neurons are like, they just explode and sort of reach out and go in the direction of where they're ultimately going to be connected. And through there's a lot of complexity in this, and a lot of this is yet to be completely mapped out. But what we know is that when you start to connect to other neurons and you send signals and they send signals back, and there's this wonderful reciprocal feedback loop, you end up creating functional networks. And that process is guided in large part by use, by experience. And so if you happen to send out all kinds of connections into the speech and language part of the brain, and you happen to grow up in an environment where you are hearing English all of the time, you will maintain the synaptic connections and grow them that are connected to the sounds of English. But the connections that would be stimulated by the sounds of speaking Japanese start to resorb. And you lose those over time. And so if you learn Japanese after you're 5 years old, you have a very hard time doing it without having some residual accent. And so it's one of these interesting phenomenon that we have all these genetic sort of maps that play out, but it's experience that essentially creates this final sculpting and shaping. And there's a couple important points about this. That the pattern of activity that you experience influences the strength of the connection. And patterns lead to more organized neural networks than chaos. You can actually put a child in an environment where they hear randomly generated words. And you could actually put them in an environment where they heard 10 times as many words as a child who was spoken to in a normal language that was not chaotic. And the child who was spoken to with 1/10 the number of words he heard would learn language, and the child who had the randomly generated words would not learn language. It's because patterns make all the difference. Now, one of the things that we know about this principle of patterns, and I'll come back to this in a second, we also know about this specificity. So specificity means that if you have alterations in the neural networks involved in the stress response, and I'll talk again after the break, I'll talk about what those alterations can look like. But let's say that these are abnormally functioning. And one of the manifestations of that is that you're continually getting disorganizing input from down here up into the part of the brain involved in learning how to read. And so Billy is in the first grade, second grade, third grade, and he's having a hard time learning how to read. And so the normal tendency of the adult world is to send Billy to a tutor. You're going to sit and you're going to get cognitive enrichment. We're going to sit down and I'm going to read with you, read with you, read with you, read with you, read with you. And that tends to be not very efficient. In large part because it's not adhering to the principle of specificity. A child who's continually getting disorganizing input from down here is never going to benefit optimally from cognitive content that's focused at language. Now the irony is, if you take a kid like Billy who's got trauma-related dysregulation and he has trouble reading, and you let him walk and do language-related things, or you do pattern, repetitive, rhythmic stuff, and you try to teach them language with hip hop or some other rhythmic activity, guess what? They learn to read just like that. It's a very interesting thing. Some of you may have heard, I remember a long time ago when I was in medical school, somebody was using a technique where they would take kids and they'd crawl around, and before they had kids that were having a hard time learning how to read, instead of focusing on teaching them to read, they would have them do these crawling exercises with bilateral stimulation, and everybody thought, oh, this is horse shit. But they kept having good results. And it actually makes sense when you think about it. One of the most interesting bodies of work related to this is people who have strokes. Some of you may have a family member or somebody you know who had a stroke. And the strokes that most people survive are cortical. They're in the top part of your brain, and the common issues that people have to do with speech and language loss. And then sometimes they get paralysis on one side of the body, and so frequently interventions for people that have strokes involve speech and language therapy and physical therapy. And it just so happened that people who were doing what's called restorative neurology were looking at this really carefully, and what they found was that the people who went to just speech and language therapy but didn't get physical therapy learned language slower, recovered language slower than people that went to physical therapy and didn't go to speech and language therapy. Pretty interesting, right? But it makes sense when you think about what we're talking about. The brain develops, and I started to show you this when I was just kind of goofing around, but the brain develops from the bottom up. Your brain is essentially, when you think about it, your brain kind of develops like an unfolding flower. And again, this is an oversimplification, but in utero, you have a lot of brain organization, very rapid changes. This is the most rapidly changing part of the brain, is this red part. And you get this sort of pillar of organization that occurs in utero. And then after birth, this part of the brain is organized, the pink part, and then around that, again, from the bottom up and the inside out is the way you develop. And so as you get older and older, your brain gets increasingly organized, and the last part of your brain, of course, to organize is the top part of your brain. In fact, the cortex doesn't fully organize till you're about 30 years old. Now, the other thing about that's important to remember, and I'll just pull up a different set of slides to show this, is that if you look at, and I mentioned this, if you look at the way the brain functions, and you think about this regulatory set of networks in the lower part of your brain, and if you're getting incoming input from your body that says you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not cold, and you're getting from the external world, you're getting all the input you're getting, it's not very complex, it's not new. In other words, you're in a safe and familiar environment, and you're not being asked to engage in a lot of sort of social interactions. In other words, not always, but in general, solitude, satiety, and safety lead to this ability to have this optimal reflective cognition. And you're using this calm, thoughtful, abstract part of your brain, and this is when you're most creative, right? And then you get out in the real world. And this is just the reality. You go to work and you have social interactions you have to deal with, you have appointments, and so rather than using this most brilliant sort of abstract thinking part of your brain, you're essentially using pre-existing problem-solving stuff to deal with the present. You're not really, you can learn, you can put new content in your head when you're in this state, but you can't really create new things when you're in this state. So there's a big difference. The mental state for learning is different than the mental state for consolidating your learning. And what you've been doing, I kind of joked with you a little bit about dissociation. Here you are, a new slide, and here you are dissociating and tuning me out and actually taking the content that I've been showing you and seeing where it fits with your existing frame of reference. And that's normal. Now the interesting thing, the beautiful thing about this, and I'll come back and talk about this, is it's rhythmic. There's a rhythm to being externally engaged and internally reflective. And that rhythm, if you get it right, if somebody can teach you well, it's regulating, it's pleasurable. And so it's like a good conversation, for example, uses this rhythmic back and forth where you focus on what somebody's saying, and even while they're still talking, you start to disengage and think about how you're going to respond. Now, if you're like me, you jump all over whatever somebody's saying before they can even finish it, and and you get reminded to shut up again. Okay. But I get so excited. But now, here's what happens in a normal classroom. Here's what happens in a normal interaction with a child and a parent. The child will watch you. The child will be watching you and seeing what you're doing, and then they'll reflect on what it is, and they'll sort of envision themselves doing the same thing, and then they may go out and they may try and practice a little bit with you, and there's this back and forth, and it's got a rhythm to it. Now, the interesting thing about this externally focused state, I talked about filling your active working memory cup. This is really important for parents to remember. This is also important for therapists to remember. Even if you're neurotypically well organized, right? About the longest that you can stay fully externally engaged before you start to disengage and start to drift off is about 12 to 15 seconds. Now, this is a really important thing because a lot of us get frustrated when things that we're trying to communicate are inefficiently processed. And unfortunately, rather than recognizing that there's this normal style of interaction and cognition, we sort of interpret that as, you're not listening to me, you're not respecting me, you're whatever it is. And a lot of times, that's a misinterpretation. It's a misunderstanding of normal cognition. Now, because of what I'm going to talk about after the break, these normal cognitive mechanisms can sometimes be magnified in these kids. And I'll talk about that a little bit. But let me keep going with some of this state-dependent functioning stuff. So here you are. This is us. We're lucky enough to most of the time be here, and then we can be over here. But everybody, if they start to get more threatened, if you activate your stress response in extreme ways, what happens is the lower systems in your brain take over. And now there's a good reason for that, but the consequence of that, of course, is that you have less access and availability of the really smart part of your brain. You have less access and availability to the part of your brain that tells time. And the result is, for kids who have had developmental trauma, or adults, when they're in this state, frequently their brain is kind of fumbling with whether or not something right now is really happening now, or is this something from the past? And so they may take somebody who has always been kind and loving and attentive to them, and if they get into this state, their brain can interpret your behaviors as if they're coming from somebody who hurt them in the past. And it literally, their brain plays tricks on them. Their brain makes them act and behave as if you are either the person that hurt them in the past, or similar enough to that person to have this defensive reaction. Which, of course, as all of you know, once that happens, then there's all kinds of problems. And then, of course, if you get even further and you get down to this state, you have the meltdown, where there's just sort of the rocking or the screaming and the kind of just multiple versions of the total regressive meltdown. When in fact the child is not thinking and will not be responsive to words. And despite that, even if you know that, what do? We talk to them. When we should just be humming or singing. We should be humming. But it's hard to do because guess where we are? We're here. Right? This is the whole thing, and we'll talk about this. Human beings are contagious. We are contagious creatures. And if we've got a kid who's dysregulated, and we we ourselves are a little bit tired, overwhelmed. It's the end of the day. We got a million things to do. We come home at the end of school, and we make the mistake of asking them about their homework before we feed them, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose. And they throw down their books, and that because you've had a day, you sort of, instead of using the cortex, right, and regulating yourself, you sort of have only partial access to your cortex. Pretty soon you get in a co-dysregulating interaction. And you're yelling, and they're yelling, and it's a meltdown, and everything is bad. Now, ideally, we would love to have this. But it's really important to note, and I'll come back and talk about this a little bit today, maybe a little bit more tomorrow. See, if you start here, it's a lot easier to do this. But very few of us start there. We start here. Because we are rescuers. Right? We are rescuers. And oh my God forbid, you go to your book group and you go to your exercise class and you go to a movie, you go on a date, God forbid. I'll spank you about that. I'm going to spank you about taking care of yourselves. I'm not kidding. Because I'm telling you, if you are not good to yourself, you cannot regulate these kids. And you are the irony is, the very people who have the big hearts that take these kids in tend to be the same people who have the hardest time giving themselves a little bit of a break. And you know, we're going to have a talk about that. But we'll come back and revisit this a little bit more. Now, this is sort of this was all kind of a roundabout way to introduce and get to one issue that I wanted to introduce, and that has to do with rhythm. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes before I let you go, but I want to focus on this. Rhythm. Rhythm is a good thing. Now, the reason rhythm is a good thing is that somatosensory rhythm, somato is body, sensory is from your senses. Somatosensory rhythm has been woven into the regulatory and reward neurobiology in our brains in ways that give us these incredible gifts that unfortunately we don't use very much in the modern world. So I want to give you a little bit of an understanding about how really the science behind this, the neurobiology behind this, and then we will take a break. So let me do this really quickly. I'll come back and do the same. Again, like I said, I will revisit this, but I want to do the initial introductory part of this right now. So, one of the great qualities of the brain, and again, this is just part of the way we're put together. So your brain is essentially trying to make sense out of the world that you are in. So you're trying to make sense out of the world, and you're even trying to make sense and make meaning out of the world in utero. And the way your brain does this is in the beginning, as you're developing. Now remember, all of your senses come into your body separately, right? Touch comes in separately, vision comes into a different part of your brain, hearing goes into a different part. And so all this sensory stuff that we use to make sort of this complete representation of the world, it comes in separately. And we have to connect it to make sense out of the world. How many of you have watched a very poorly dubbed foreign film? Right? My favorite were the old kung fu movies, like, I'm going to get you. And you're like, whoa. And it's weird, right? But it helps you appreciate that you have to sync the sound and the movement, the visual input, or it just is very dysregulating. And so one of the things that happens is when your brain sees patterns of neural activity that are novel or that don't fit, you get a little bit of a stress response. One of my favorite examples of this is that 1,000,000 times you've heard and your brain has processed this. You come in, you see some people you know, you go, hey, what's up? And people have this certain latency and go, nothing, what's up with you? But how many times have you walked into a room and people were talking about you, and you walk in and go, hey, what's up? And they're like, oh, nothing. And immediately you go, oh, bullshit. That's because you feel that, because you can feel it, right? Everybody's had that experience. And so, or when your kid comes in late, like, where were you? The movies. What movie? As soon as you get that, my wife does that with me all the time. You like it? I'm like, The latency to respond gets me every time. I thought maybe I could just go, yes, every time, yes. And of course, once in a while you can say yes too fast, and then she's like, and I'm going, oh God, is it the carpet? Is it did she get a haircut? Is it like, I don't know what I'm supposed to like or not. Anyway, so, now, all of this is by way of saying what your brain does is it makes associations between patterns of neural activity that co-occur. Right? When two things that happen together again and again and again and again get woven together. This is what language is, right? You see something and you hear a sound, and ultimately you connect the sound to what you see. This is the way your brain works. In utero, in the fetus, the little fetal body is sending signals, pattern repetitive signals, up into the lower part of the brain that correspond to not being cold, not being thirsty, not being hungry, because you're getting nonstop calories and you're in liquid and you're 98.7. And so you're literally continually getting from your body the neural signals that say, I'm regulated, I'm regulated, I'm regulated, I'm regulated, I'm regulated, I'm regulated. And of course, that's happening at the same time that the little fetal senses are developing, and you're getting input from auditory and vibratory and tactile sensory input that's pattern, repetitive, syncopated rhythms of maternal heart rate. And so your brain makes an association between pattern, repetitive, somato-sensory activity at certain frequencies and regulation. And so after the baby's born and they're all upset, we rock them. And we rock them in a frequency that is soothing to them. And it is most typically, roughly, the most consistent maternal heart rate that mother had. Between 64 and 80 beats usually. Now, if mom had a high resting heart rate because she was had hyperthyroidism, a child needs or seeks and responds to a faster rhythm. If mother had a low resting heart rate, the child seeks and prefers a different sensory preference. And as those of you who had multiple kids, you know that kids kind of have differences in the way they respond. But the bottom line is every single person in this room has some form of patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity that regulates them. Whether it's music or whether it's, some people find it even in tiny little fine motor stuff. Some kids that we work with just love large motor stuff, walking, running, riding a bike, swimming. All of that stuff is regulating. And we'll come back and talk about it later on. And one of the most powerful things about that is that pattern, repetitive, rhythmic activity adheres to the principle of specificity beautifully, because that incoming input from the outside world goes right here directly to this part of the brain. And so if you want to teach a kid who has trauma-related dysregulation and can't learn how to read, if you want that child to learn how to read, first you've got to regulate the child. And once you regulate the child, then you can get to the cortex. And we have come up with, and we use this frequently, this sequencing of engagement. This is probably one of the more useful, simple, what we call heuristics that we use that kind of captures a lot of what I've been talking about. If you want to get to this really smart part of your brain, if you really want to reason with the child, you really can't do it until you've connected with the child effectively, and you can't effectively connect unless they're regulated at least to a certain degree. And on top of that, probably, I don't want to say more important, but probably more important, is that you need to remember this. Human beings are contagious. And so if you're not regulated, there's just no way you can regulate somebody else. If you want to reason with a child, if you want to connect with the sort of the most human part of their brain in effective ways, yelling won't work. And this is where self-care comes in. And again, we'll come back and talk about it, but just remember that the process of communication involves getting something from your cortex, right? this part of your brain, out through the dumbest part of your brain, up through the dumb part of their brain, through all their filters and landmines, up to this part of the brain. And we all have these filters. And after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about this. So, 15-minute break. I'll be back here, and hopefully you will as well.